Alrighty.
Alrighty then. Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from beautiful Florida, and tonight we're discussing cartomancy, which is reading cards. And I want to say before we begin that I occasionally have a little difficulty with my internet if I break up. Just let me know, I'll repeat myself. It's entirely possible that won't happen, but if it does, just let me know if you need me to repeat anything. Um, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the history of cards, and then we will talk a little bit about the different kinds of cards, and then we will talk primarily about tarot because that is where my principal expertise lies. But historically, cards go back a long way. They originate in China, and the original cards, if you want to call them that, were tiles, like what you would see in dominoes or mahjong. That was the earliest form of what became cards. Later, they were put onto heavy paper, and they moved west in that form. They became very popular in India. They moved into the Arab Middle East and thence into Europe. Cards arrived in Europe around the turn of the 14th century, as best as can be said. The earliest decks that survive come from that period. The earliest mentions of cards come from that period. It's possible they'd been there for a little while already, but there's no way to know one way or the other, but more or less early 14th century. And how they got there, nobody really knows for certain. There are a number of theories. Some people think that they were brought back from the Middle East by crusaders. Some people think the Romani people brought them from the Middle East into Europe. There are various other ideas, but that's when cards show up in Europe. And the first cards that appear to have shown up, the oldest surviving cards, are what we would call playing cards. Tarot cards come just a little bit later, although again, there's no certainty that the oldest surviving deck was necessarily the first deck. And it's not a big gap in time between playing cards and tarot cards. They also show up in the 14th century. Tarot cards appear to have originated in the aristocratic courts of Italy, and they made their first appearance there, and they show a lot of influence from that milieu. And they also draw heavily upon things like Hermeticism and alchemy, which were very much in vogue in the courts of Italy. So that is the basic origin for playing in tarot cards. And cards received a mixed reaction in Europe. There was a wholehearted embrace of them by many people and a rejection of them by others. There are early edicts against playing cards. And it's important to bear in mind that the tarot, although we think of it primarily in terms of divination, is also a playing card deck that's still popular for that purpose in Europe. And what we think of as playing cards is also a divination deck, which is still popular for that purpose as well. And that brings us to our second subject, which is the types of cards. And the three types of cards you're mostly going to encounter are the playing cards, which we all know what playing cards are, but we'll come back to them in a moment. The tarot cards, and probably everyone here knows what tarot cards are, but we're going to come back to them in a moment, and oracle cards. Now, playing cards have four suits, and in English usage, they are clubs, spades, hearts, and diamonds. Different parts of Europe actually had different suits, but they all correspond to the same principles. And they also have three court cards, the knave, the queen, and the king. Tarot cards have all of those cards, plus they have an additional court card, which is variously the knight, the princess, there are four court cards in a tarot deck: the knight or prince, the princess, the queen, the king. And otherwise, the four suits of tarot are pretty much as playing cards, but then you also have the major arcana. The major arcana represent metaphysical ideas, spiritual ideas, and at the beginning of the use of tarot cards, there was no set number for these. They could be any number of major arcana cards, and they included often things like astrological signs, the muses, the graces, things that you don't find in modern major arcana. The number of the major arcana and what they are over time became mostly solidified. There are differing schools of thought about them even today that change some of the numbers around, some of the symbols around, and that will always happen because it's a living discipline. People interpret the cards differently. People who create them differently. And it's only to be expected that you will see changes in anything that's been around for hundreds of years. And if you study the history of cards, you see a lot of changes in tarot. Some of them not ones you'd expect. For example, during the French Revolution, the revolutionary authorities had a problem with the court cards because they were trying to get rid of the aristocracy. And that extended to playing cards and tarot cards, where the court cards were revolutionized, for one of a better way to put it, and replaced with revolutionary rather than royal symbolism. But as we come into the modern age, tarot took basically two forms for much of the 20th century. One was the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, where the artwork was created by Pamela Colman Smith. The other was Crowley's Tarot of Thoth, where the artwork was created by Lady Frida Harris. And then, of course, there were still older decks, such as the Tarot of Marseille, that were continuing to circulate. And when I was learning tarot back in the 70s, these were basically the only decks that were available and variations on them. Today, of course, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of tarot decks. And this development has been fed both by the fact that people who use tarot for divination like to have a wide range to choose from and have developed many new and different versions of tarot, but also from the fact that people who use tarot for playing cards also enjoy collecting different artistic interpretations. So both of these markets are driving the proliferation of tarot card designs. And the final form of cards that we're going to talk about are oracle cards. And oracle cards are cards that are used for divination, but are not either playing cards or tarot cards. They are their own separate thing. An example of these are the so-called Gypsy Witch cards, or the Osho Zen deck, or any number of different divination systems that use cards but do not reflect tarot symbolism. Now, it is also worth saying that tarot symbolism is still alive and developing. I've designed a couple of tarot decks. One of them is the Tarot of Hecate, which we'll be looking at tonight. But in its full form, the Tarot of Hecate has 100 cards, whereas an ordinary tarot deck has 78. And that's because we added additional cards to expand on the meanings. But we won't be going into that tonight. But this is something that you will see as you look at different tarot decks. Some of them include cards or variations on cards that are not normally in a tarot deck. Others have different arrangements of the cards. And so it is still definitely a living discipline that is continuing to evolve. Now, when you read cards, what you do, as a general rule, is you shuffle them, or the person who's being read for shuffles them. People do this in different ways. Sometimes the reader doesn't want the person being read to touch the deck. They'll do the shuffling. Other times, the person doing the reading will feel it's very important for the person being read to shuffle the cards. This is entirely a matter of personal preference. Either one can absolutely work. But the cards get shuffled, and cards are drawn more or less at random and laid out in a spread where they are read from. The most common spread is probably the Celtic Cross. But there are also very simple spreads, such as a 1-card reading or a 3-card reading, which can be just as effective. People have a lot of superstitions about reading cards, whether tarot cards or playing cards. A lot of people will have the attitude that their cards can be very temperamental. I don't permit my cards to be temperamental. They will have the attitude that their cards have to be like wrapped in silk and put in special little boxes. I don't do any of that. I believe in simple, happy cards, and they cooperate with me, so it obviously works. On the other hand, some people prefer very elaborate ways of handling their cards, and if that works for them, that's just fine too. What I thought I would do is go through a tarot deck, show you what the cards are and what they mean. And we'll see where we're at the end of that. We may go to questions. We might do a sample reading. We will see what is convenient and what people would like to do. I'm using the Tarot of Hecate for this discussion. However, I've taken out the extra cards, so we have only the cards that would constitute a normal tarot deck, because that's really what we're speaking of. Now, in terms of reading playing cards, if I read playing cards, I read them very much as I would read the minor arcana of the tarot, but there's a whole discipline for reading playing cards, but that is not my specialty. So we'll be speaking about tarot this evening. And we're going to start with the major arcana. And the major arcana are considered to speak to spiritual issues, to existential issues. And as I was taught tarot, they also speak to the nature of existence. They are a visual scripture, for want of a better way to put it. They speak to spiritual ideas and spiritual beliefs. The first card is the Fool. And I see that we're going to mirror all of our words tonight, but that's all right. I will tell you what they say. But the Fool, the first card, as I interpret the Fool is God before creation, primordial deity, chaos, if you would. The Fool represents that moment before anything has come into being, when everything is possible. And in a reading, that is what the Fool represents. If you get the Fool, it means that the pattern has not been set, and you can set it as you would have it. With the Fool represents, again, the chaos moment when old patterns are not there and new patterns can be created. So if you're asking particularly questions about how a project will go, what direction to go in, the Fool says that you can go where you want to go because there is nothing to hold you back. Fool also says to trust yourself and not to be afraid of new beginnings and new directions, but to go ahead and proceed. In the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and decks like it, the Fool is shown walking off the edge of a cliff. And the idea behind this is that as long as the Fool believes that they can walk off into thin air, they will be able to do so. But if they doubt themselves, they will fall. So the Fool is also a card saying have confidence in yourself and what you are doing and go forward with it. After the Fool is the Magician or the Magus, or any of a number of other names that represent a person who uses magic. And as I understand this card, it represents the moment of creation. It represents, in Wiccan thought, the god, the material world, the creation of what would become the physical world as we know it. And as you can see, it's represented in the picture by a solar deity. And in a reading, the Magus represents your ability to create what you want. The Magus can work their will in the world and also needs to do so. So if you draw the Magus, it says that you can make what you want to make. You have absolutely the power to do so, but you must in fact do so. And that is the Magus. The High Priestess is the third card. And as you can see, she is here represented as a lunar goddess. And as I understand the High Priestess, she represents the goddess or the yin aspect of creation. And in the Vangelo delle Streghe, the story of creation that I subscribe to as a Corellian, when primordial deity created existence, it did so by separating itself into the yin and the yang elements, the female and the male elements. And the male elements are the god who became physical existence. The female elements are the goddess, who is spiritual existence. When you draw the high priestess in a reading, it's saying to draw upon your spiritual self, to meditate, to look within, to be guided by your higher self and your soul, because the spiritual nature of existence is the meaning of the card. And when you draw this, you should turn to spiritual means. The next card is the Empress. And the Empress represents the ensouled universe. And in the Vangelo delle Streghe, it speaks of the goddess reuniting with the god, which represents the souls coming into matter, which existentially is what the Empress represents. The soul has come into matter, and life as we know it has come into being. In a reading, the Empress represents prosperity and well-being, abundance, and all good things. The Empress is followed by the Emperor, and I will put him up toward the screen for you. And as I understand the Emperor, I do want to point out that the Emperor in the last 50 years has been subject to a very wide range of interpretations, ranging from the very positive to the very negative. My interpretation of the Emperor is that the Emperor represents the cycles of existence. The Empress is the ensouled universe in a state of existence, and the Emperor is the going forth of that existence through the cycles of nature, the cycles of time, the cycles of life and death. And so this represents the form of the old god, who is the Lord of the Gate of Transformation, and these cycles which constantly revolve for all of us in life. Now, a more traditional reading of the Emperor has to do with order and authority, but the cycles of life are order. And a more revisionist interpretation looks at the Emperor as oppression and stifling of freedom, which I think really it has to do with the politics of the late 20th century. But to me, the Emperor represents cycles and goes back and forth between these things. And if you draw the Emperor, what it says is that your current situation will change no matter what it is. If it's a great situation, you must be prepared for the fact that eventually that will pass away. And if you're in a bad situation, a new situation is about to come about, which will be better. And so it represents the impermanence of your exact situation, and the fact that there's always movement in our situations. Emperor is followed by the Hierophant. And in this deck, the Hierophant is represented by the goddess Isis, also identified with Hathor in this instance. The Hierophant is represented in many different ways. The term Hierophant represents, or it literally means a priest or priestess who can initiate, an initiator, particularly in the mysteries of Eleusis, but not exclusively in that context. Historically, this card was often called the Pope, and because of that, it was subject to a wide range of interpretations based on how people felt about the papacy. As the Hierophant, the interpretations are not quite as varied. I understand this card to represent spiritual communication. Existentially speaking, it represents the fact that though we are living in the ensouled world, we can still be guided by spirit. We are still part of spirit. And in a reading, it says, again, to listen to spiritual guidance, to allow spirit to lead you. And if you are working in a magical context where you perhaps might be doing oracles or something like that, or even deep meditation, to turn to that for guidance. Let spirit guide you. The next card is the Lovers. And as you can see, in this version of the Lovers, there are 3 people, which is actually pretty traditional for the Lovers card. More recent versions of the Lovers card have only 2 people, but historically, it was usually 3. And that was because the traditional meaning of this card has to do with choice. And more modern people, more modern interpretations sometimes reduce it to romance. I don't really see this as a romantic card per se. I see it as a card of choice. And existentially speaking, I would understand it as the choice between pursuing the growth of your soul through a spiritual life or a material life. It also, in the artwork, represents the turn of the seasons, and also of life and death. And we're reminded that life and death are as two sides of a coin, the obverse and the reverse. And so whichever of the two paths you choose, material or spiritual, really in the end, you're doing the same things, you're just using different tools, and either one can be beneficial. And when you draw this card, it says that you have a very important choice to make about your situation, and basically have a choice between two roads. And that you must actively choose which you are taking. Next card is the Chariot. You'll notice in this card there is no actual chariot, unless you want to consider the dragon a chariot, but I don't see a need to be overly literal. But the Chariot represents that more physical, worldly path in terms of existential understanding. And in terms of what it would mean if you draw it in a reading, it means that you must go forward in what you're doing, that you will go forward, that you should apply action to the situation, that you should take action. It is a card that says, do what you need to do, move forward, do not stay put. And so if you were to draw this card asking whether or not you should do something, it's absolutely yes. If you're drawing this card for how something was going to unfold, it's going to tell you it will move forward quickly. The next card is Strength. And you can see in this deck, it is represented by the goddess Athena. And existentially speaking, strength represents the inner path, the spiritual path that a person might follow. It also literally represents strength, and particularly in the sense of spiritual or emotional strength. And what this card says, if you draw it in a reading, is that you have all of the strength you need to deal with whatever is there. You may feel overwhelmed by it, but you have the strength to deal with it. And you may feel yourself drawing upon that strength, but the strength is there to be drawn upon. The next card is the Hermit. And a lot of card decks will show the Hermit as kind of a ragged gray type of figure. You can see that I did not show the Hermit that way. I showed the Hermit as being quite a luxurious existence, because it's not about a physical withdrawal. It's about a spiritual looking inward. And existentially, what this card represents is working on yourself. And in a reading, it really represents the same thing, looking within, working within, could be doing your shadow work. But it says that in whatever situation this card shows up for, the answers you need are inside, the work you need to do is inside. And in some cases, it can mean that you need to pull back from a situation. But it also represents mastering that situation. And if you look closely, you'll see that we have the signs of the suits of cards also in this picture, meaning that the Hermit has gained mastery over all of the suits. And in the Tarot of Hecate, there are actually 5 suits. We're not going to talk about that 5th one tonight because we're talking about more standard tarot. But the Hermit, through looking inside, masters all of these different skills. The Hermit is followed by Fortune. And I'll just put Fortune up here. And Fortune is pretty much what it sounds like. It says that it represents the wheel of fate. It represents the fact that many things are decided in the spiritual realm and brought into the physical realm. It represents, in a reading, receiving a gift from fate, a push forward from fate. I understand it in that positive sense. Now, some people will read it in either a positive or a negative sense, depending on how it's aspected by other cards, whether it's upside down or right side up, in which case it might be either a good or bad gift from fate, but it represents a gift from fate. And as I say, for me, I always read it as a pushing forward by fate. And it's followed by justice. And I'll put her up here where you can see her. And justice is related to the fortune card. Existentially speaking, it represents karma. And as I understand karma, karma is all about attachments. And if you look at the picture, you'll see there's a spider web behind her. And the figure in the picture is Grandmother Spider. But karma is kind of like a spider web. It's attachments that we form to things that we've experienced in different lives. And as long as we hold on to that attachment, it follows us. When we can let it go, it's gone. And so existentially speaking, justice represents that process of creating and eventually resolving attachments. Now, in a reading, the way that I would read this card is that you will get what you work for, no more, no less. So if you want a good outcome from your situation, you must put the effort in, but you will not be wasting the effort. What effort you expend will be repaid. And justice is followed by the Hanged Man. I'll put him up here for you. And the Hanged Man represents, in some ways, the dark night of the soul. It represents the effort you have to put in for spiritual growth, which can sometimes be very painful. And part of that effort is toward untangling those attachments that we were talking about in the last card. And the picture here on this particular hangman represents Odin hanging from the tree to receive the runes, which represent knowledge. And Odin hung from the tree for 9 days and nights, eventually lost an eye, to obtain the magic of the runes. And that, again, represents the dark night of the soul, that you have to work through all these things to heal and release them in order to have your spiritual growth. And whether you do that consciously or unconsciously doesn't matter, but it must be done. It's followed by death. Oh boy, everybody loves the death card. And I'll hold him up here. And of course, this is not the image you commonly see of death in most tarot decks, but this is a particular tarot deck. But the idea behind it is the same. And it says death, but I often describe it as death and rebirth. It represents the eternal cycle of life and death. And existentially, that's what it means, that we die, we come back. But when we die, we reset to a certain extent to, I guess we could say, our factory settings. In a reading, what death represents is not a physical death, but an ending. It can be an ending of a situation, it can be the ending of an attitude, it can be the ending of a project, it can be the ending of a relationship. Very rarely is it actually going to represent physical death, which is a misunderstanding that people have about it. I won't say it can't represent that, but it is not what it normally represents. Now, this differs from the use of playing cards, where the Ace of Spades is used as the death card. And I believe that at least historically, traditional playing card readers meant that quite literally, but that's a different discipline. In tarot, all the readers I know would agree that death does not represent the death of the querent, but rather the death of a situation around the querent. And death is followed by temperance. And temperance is also sometimes called art or alchemy. And it represents taking one thing and making it into another, which is what the art of alchemy is all about, turning lead into gold, if you would. But it's the lead of our everyday experience turned into the gold of spiritual growth. And in a reading, it represents a situation that is going to transform. And so you must be prepared for that. If you're looking for transformation, it's a great card. If you're not expecting it, you must fasten your seatbelts, but transformation will come. And if you look at the card, you can see that we kind of have opposites on either side. And the alchemy or the temperance is in the center, where they come together to make a union. And that is the idea of temperance. Temperance is followed by the devil card, and this deck is called the Veil, but it's still the same idea. And this is one of those cards which you will find has a wide range of interpretations, depending primarily on the religion of the person doing the reading. If they come from a Judeo-Christian background, then they're more likely to see this as a bad card. If they come from a pagan background, then they may see it as a neutral or a good card. The way that I understand this card, existentially, it represents the veil that obscures our understanding of spirit, that we have to work our way through to have spiritual growth. And in a reading, it represents the need to see through illusions, to pierce your own veil. It's saying that what you think is there is not necessarily there. It often has to do with unnecessary fear or unnecessary worry, being concerned about a situation that does not require that concern. And if you can stop, look beyond your emotions, usually that situation will turn out to be not nearly as bad as you might think it will. So this card, when it comes up in a reading, for me, I understand it to mean that the client should not be worried about what they are perhaps worried about, that they can release that worry and move forward with their situation. And the devil is followed by the Tower. And you can see our Tower card here. And the Tower represents breakthrough. And if the devil card or the veil card represents looking within to see beyond the limitations of physical life, the Tower card is what comes from that, which is spiritual liberation, breaking through personal barriers and spiritual freedom. And if you look at the picture, you will see that the Tower in this case has a number of faces around the bottom. And symbolically, in this card, this represents the liberation of the soul from being bound by its previous incarnations, which represented by the Tower. And if you get the Tower in a reading, it represents change, but it's liberating change, becoming free from something which has held you back. If you get death and the Tower together, it's a huge change, because the death card tends to have more to do with physical change, the Tower more to do with spiritual or emotional change, and both of them together, of course, amplify each other. But the Tower is change, freedom from anything that's holding you back, freedom from bondage, so to speak, and ability to move forward. And existentially, that, of course, is a spiritual breakthrough. It's followed by the stars. And you can see our picture for the stars. And to me, the stars, the moon, and the sun go together as three cards that represent three different ways of pursuing the liberation that we just looked at in the Tower card. And the stars is through internal means such as meditation, shadow work, working on yourself in general, which can lead you to that spiritual liberation. If it comes up in a reading, it means that you need to do those things. You need to meditate on your situation. You maybe need to do some shadow work. You need to look inside yourself, and that you will find what you need to find there. You will address what you need to address there within yourself. It's followed by the moon. And I'll put the moon up here. And The moon, to me, represents a more formalized religious way of going about seeking that spiritual breakthrough. And so it can mean prayer, it can mean divination, it can mean ritual or ceremony. The more formal ways of pursuing spiritual enlightenment. And when the moon comes up in a reading, it recommends those things. For example, you might turn to divination specifically, that you might want to do magic to alleviate your situation, because the moon also represents magic. And then we have the sun. I'll hold the sun up here for you. And the sun is the third of those three different ways of pursuing spiritual liberation. I understand it to mean that you pursue it through physical actions, physical activity in the world. And in a reading, the sun usually represents victory. It means that you'll be successful at whatever you're doing and should absolutely continue doing it and should have confidence in moving forward with it. Spiritually, it represents taking that physical approach to enlightenment. You can also look at star, moon, and sun sequentially. That you begin by looking within, then you bring it out in a more formalized manner, and then you just live it. But all three of them refer to how to reach that tower moment when you cast off restraint. It's followed by judgment. And judgment, as I understand it, well, you can kind of see from the picture, that it represents being in the state that is free from that spiritual restraint, having achieved what you're working for in your spiritual life, in your soul. In a reading, it means having things resolved in your favor, achieving something you've worked for, reaching a plateau. And so a very positive card. Then the last card is the universe, which in this deck is just black because it represents coming to the end of your soul's journey and reunion with deity, and who knows what that looks like. So we left this picture black. In other decks, it can be different. But in a reading, it represents getting everything that you're wanting. Very, very positive outcome card. It represents the achievement or acquisition of what you have desired. So those are the major arcana. And we are about 40 minutes through our class. So I'm going to go through the minor arcana now, but probably not in quite as much detail if we want to have time for any questions, because we are actually on a tightish schedule this evening, because there's a class behind us. So the first deck of the minor arcana are wands. And wands have to do with physical situations, can have to do with political situations, interpersonal situations. And to go through wands quickly, you have the Ace of Wands, which represents a situation in which you're putting a great deal of energy. It's a situation that has a lot of concern attached to it, but usually in a positive way, and a lot of energy attached to it, a vital, important type of situation. Followed by the Two of Wands, which represents beginning a new project, beginning a new journey, moving forward. The Three of Wands, which represents getting help or assistance from another person in terms of your ambitions, your desires, your projects. The Four of Wands, which is achieving at least some of your ambitions, achieving what you've been working for, very good positive outcome card. Not the end of a journey, but a wonderful positive place in a journey where you have gotten, again, what you've been working for. And these usually have to do, again, with worldly goals, sometimes political types of interpersonal goals, but definitely with the physical world. Five of Wands is conflict. Often it's internal conflict, can be external conflict, but I usually think of it as internal conflict, not necessarily knowing which direction you want to go from where you are. We have the Six of Wands. And the Six of Wands, again, represent victory and represent having achieved what you're working on. In this case, in a little bit more of a somewhat more permanent state. The Four of Wands is the celebration of success, but the Six of Wands is more the consolidation of success. The Seven of Wands represents victory after hard work. It represents being in a situation where you don't necessarily have what you desire, but you're working towards it and you have the ability to achieve it. The Eight of Wands represents speed. If you get the Eight of Wands, things will happen very quickly and move forward very quickly. The Nine of Wands is exactly the opposite. It represents waiting. It represents in a reading that you have to wait before your situation will come to any sort of movement. So you have to have patience and just kind of wait it out. If it's a question of whether or not to do something, this card indicates it will take a long time. And then the Ten of Wands, which is a situation that is almost ready to cross over, but not quite. It's almost there, but it isn't there yet. And if you were to get this in a reading, I would say that represents the need for patience because you've almost got what you want, but not quite. And it's followed by the Princess of Wands. And the Princess of Wands, I understand to represent a situation or a person who has everything that they need, but just isn't quite ready to happen yet. It's the kind of situation where you look at it and say, why isn't this moving? Well, it's not the right time yet. This is a card that says you must wait for the right time because you're not quite at it, but you're getting there quickly. And you will find that you have everything you need. The Prince of Wands represents a need for focus and to focus on what it is you're doing. It's not that there is a lack of resources or a lack of energy, but they're being dissipated. So when you get this card, you need to focus your energies in order to move forward. And when you get this card, it's saying the person is not, in fact, focusing their energies at this time, they're scattering them. And so it recommends doing the opposite. Queen of Wands represents having lots and lots of good things, enough for yourself, enough to share with other people, enough to spread around. It's a card of great prosperity. If it represents a person, it's the kind of person who helps other people. The element of using resources to be of help to others is very important in this card. Then we have the King of Wands, which represents the ability to do what you desire to do, the ability to focus. This card has to do with focused energy, focused effort. And if you draw it, it tells you that's what you should do. If you're drawing it to represent a person, it's what they are doing. And at this point, we are down to about 10 minutes from the end of our class. So I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions. And let's not all answer at once. If nobody has any questions, I will go ahead and speak to, oh, hello.
I actually do. And I'll just make it a quick one because I have a whole list, of course. When you spoke about one suit that I've never seen before, the Graces, or one group of cards.
Oh, in the Renaissance period, there are many other cards that were often included in the major arcana, and there was no set rule. So if you look at some of those Renaissance card decks, they will have, for example, the 3 Graces, the 9 Muses, the 12 astrological signs, the 7 planets.
Okay, I wasn't sure if that's what you meant, or if it was more of a royalty.
No, they were part of the major arcana. And when we were creating the Tarot of Hecate, because we have an expanded major arcana, this was one of the things we studied, because it is not without precedent to have other cards in your major arcana. It just has been out of use for
a while.
And so when we put them in, we were actually, in our opinion, following a traditional precedent. And do you have any other questions?
One more. How do you feel about people touching your cards when you're doing your reading?
I'm not bothered by it. I figure my energy is not going to be disrupted by anything casual. I know people who are terribly upset if someone touches their cards. My attitude is that an energetic charge is more than strong enough to stand up to that. And you know, I had a question on my vlog recently about putting stones in into a construction to impart energies to the house.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions was that if the builder put the stones in, would their energy disrupt the charge that the person had put on their stones? And my answer to that is no, it shouldn't. Unless possibly that builder has a metaphysical background and is trying to disrupt the charge should stand up to any amount of handling. And it's the same with tarot cards. Obviously, there are other people who feel differently, but I've never had any problem with it. And I've been reading since the 1970s. So,
because I don't think I've ever had a reading where the reader didn't ask you to either cut left or right, or at least put your hand on it, or pull one card for the first being flipped. So that's kind of odd to hear that somebody wouldn't want you to touch their cards.
Yeah. When I do readings for people, I usually ask them to shuffle the cards.
Right.
But I have known people who use tarot who would not even let the client touch the cards. They would shuffle them themselves. And sometimes I do that also. I mean, it depends on the circumstance.
Right.
But not because I'm afraid of the person touching them, but just because the circumstance favors my doing the shuffling. Also, some people don't shuffle very well.
Right.
But that's another thing. But I find some people have a neurotic relationship to their tarot cards. Their tarot cards behave kind of like an abusive spouse. And maybe some people need that, but I don't see any reason for it.
I agree.
And my experience is that they will act as you wish them to act. So if you don't make them into little prima donnas, they won't be.
I like that. I like that. Thank you. Anyone else?
We have what I believe is a room link put into the chat room, which I believe is for the class that is following us.
Yes.
So we have a few more minutes, so I'm going to run very briefly through the remaining minor arcana, and then we can do some more questions. So the other suits are swords, and swords have to do, they often have to do with conflict. They sometimes have to do with difficulties. I would prefer to think of them as having to do with conflict, which can be positive or negative. But swords definitely, they're pointier than the other suits. And they tend to, the link was to purchase the deck. Yes, you can get the Tarot of Hecate at witchschoolstore.com or tarotofhecate.com. That's Hecate with a K. Or CorellianPublishing.com.
No, I just posted the link. The link is for what you said before.
Oh, it is? Good.
I just took it upon myself to, hey, if anybody wants it, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, well, we still got to plug in for where to get them. So that's what swords are about. Then we have cups, which tend to be about romantic situations. Swords can also be about organizational or even national political types of situations if the person has relevance to that. Cups almost always are romantic, but they can also be other kinds of important relationships as well. So, for example, the Two of Cups, you can see has a couple in the picture, but it can represent a romantic relationship or a very strong friendship or other type of relationship, and the whole suit is like that. It's not necessarily romantic. And then the final suit are the Pentacles, and you can see our Tarot of Hecate Pentacles here. and pentacles have to do with money and prosperity issues. And so, for example, the Four of Pentacles has to do with being in a place of stagnation, unwillingness to move, holding yourself back. Where, for example, the Eight of Pentacles has to do with mastering of abilities that bring prosperity and success to the person. So we have 5 minutes left. And do we have any more questions? Lori, you disappeared just when I asked for more questions. Again, if you're interested in the Tarot of Hecate, you can get it from CorellianPublishing.com, tarotofhecate.com, witchghoulstore.com. And did you have another question for us by any chance, Lori?
So with the suit cards, how is it, how do you memorize? Because this is where I'm having an issue. Like, each suit represents an element or something.
You broke up for me a little bit there.
Can you hear me now? Oh, you're frozen on for me. Can you hear me?
Each suit represents an element and a quality.
So my issue is memorizing.
I can hear you now.
Okay, so my issue is memorizing like the Ace of Wands to the Nine of Wands, let's say, because they each represent something different. No?
Actually, and we don't have enough time to go through them tonight, but each one has a story. And this is not true, obviously, for the older types of tarot deck where you only had like 1 wand, 2 wands, 3 wands.
Right.
But since the Rider-Waite-Smith, most more modern tarot decks tell a story through pictures through the deck that helps you to remember the meaning.
Okay.